On 21st May 1942, a supply corridor south of Kharkov became the site of an explosion sequence that German records later described as disproportionate to the means used. A convoy of Soviet fuel trucks, escorted by light armored cars, moved along a narrow road bordered by marshy ground and scattered woodland. The route had been deemed low risk by Soviet staff because German units in the sector had been pushed back days earlier, creating the impression that no organized obstacles remained. However, German retreat in that area had not been uniform. Pioneering detachments, engineer elements responsible for demolitions, obstacles, and last-minute defensive measures, were often the last to withdraw. Their operational doctrine emphasized delaying the enemy rather than holding ground, and they applied this doctrine with improvisation when resources were scarce. In this particular sector, the rapid Soviet advance had disrupted German supply lines, leaving engineer groups with minimal explosives and limited time. The standard anti-vehicle minefields could not be laid in the required density, and most of the heavy charges had already been expended in bridge demolitions along the main retreat routes. German engineers faced the challenge of delaying motorized Soviet transport using whatever remained. One report from the German Sixth Army's engineering staff noted the use of visual decoys, makeshift constructions intended to guide enemy vehicles into predictable routes. These structures, often resembling debris from earlier fighting, were placed to force convoys toward prepared obstacles. The method was rarely effective against armored formations, but Soviet supply units, under pressure to maintain the momentum of the offensive, tended to follow paths that appeared recently cleared. On the morning of 21st May, German engineers applied a variation of this tactic. With insufficient mines to cover the width of the road, they concentrated their remaining charges in a pattern that by itself provided poor coverage. But instead of trying to conceal the mines traditionally, they used scattered branches, broken fence posts, and crude wooden poles to shape a visual channel across the road. These objects appeared haphazard, almost foolishly placed, stupid-looking, as one post-war analysis later phrased it. The objective was simple: create the impression that the road had been recently cleared by retreating Soviet units, leaving behind debris that marked the safe lane. In reality, that lane led directly across the densest concentration of buried explosives. The concept relied on a predictable behavior. Under time pressure, convoy commanders preferred to follow paths that looked previously used rather than risk driving into areas that might contain mines. The Germans had observed this pattern in earlier phases of the campaign. By manipulating the visual cues, they aimed to funnel the Soviet vehicles into a narrow strip where their limited explosives could achieve maximum effect. At approximately midday, as the Soviet convoy approached, the gamble paid off. The lead armored car slowed briefly to maneuver between the makeshift markers, then accelerated through the apparent safe corridor. Behind it, fuel trucks followed in close spacing, standard Soviet practice to reduce the risk of air attack on long columns. When the first set of pressure fuses activated, the entire lane ignited in a chain reaction. The result was far larger than the engineers had anticipated. Fuel tanks ruptured, fumes ignited, and the confined spacing of vehicles turned the explosion into a rolling firestorm across the road. Within 3 minutes, the convoy ceased to exist as a coherent formation. The effectiveness of the ambush stemmed not from the amount of explosive used, but from how the engineers exploited predictable convoy behavior. German pioneering doctrine taught that when material was scarce, obstacles should manipulate the enemy psychologically rather than physically. In this case, the crude markers, branches, fence posts, and scattered boards created a false sense of order on a road otherwise cluttered with natural debris. Soviet drivers advancing at speed relied heavily on visual cues. Units moving during offensive momentum often lacked detailed reconnaissance. Roadways marked by fresh-looking disturbances or cleared paths were interpreted as previously used by friendly vehicles. By arranging the debris in a seemingly careless but intentional pattern, the German engineers crafted a navigational suggestion that aligned exactly with the mine concentration. The mine configuration itself also reflected necessity. Fragmented stocks of explosives left the engineers with a mix of standard Teller mines, improvised charges, and captured Soviet munitions with unreliable fuses. Individually, these devices lacked the power to halt an entire convoy. Concentrated into a narrow strip, however, they could trigger overlapping detonations. The key was ensuring the enemy entered the strip willingly. The engineers placed the charges deeper than usual, expecting heavy vehicles to apply sufficient pressure to activate them. They connected some of the mines with minimal wiring, not for synchronized detonation, but to increase the odds that at least two would explode simultaneously. A dual explosion beneath a fuel truck was likely to rupture tanks and ignite the vapors, a catastrophic multiplier. Even small charges could achieve. Soviet unit logs recovered later showed that the convoy commander assumed the lane was safe because it appeared pressed down, as if armored tracks had already passed through. The engineers had created that effect deliberately, dragging weighted boards over the soil to simulate vehicle compression. It was a simple technique, one that looked improvised and unprofessional, but it aligned perfectly with expectations of a recently contested front line. When the first armored car triggered the initial blast, the vehicle absorbed most of the direct damage but remained upright long enough for the trucks behind it to enter the kill zone. The spacing between vehicles, reduced for protection against air attack, now ensured maximum vulnerability. Fuel trucks positioned nose to tail allowed cascading ignition as ruptured tanks sprayed burning fuel forward and backward. The engineers monitoring the ambush from concealed positions noted the immediate transformation of the road. A column of fire erupted vertically, then spread horizontally as fuel ignited. Secondary blasts came from stored ammunition on the escort vehicles. The heat cracked the asphalt, adding smoke and debris that prevented following units from understanding the scale of destruction ahead until they were too close to stop. German operational reports highlight the efficiency of the event. Minimal expenditure of munitions for maximum disruption. The convoy's destruction delayed Soviet resupply efforts in that corridor for more than a day. Engineers recorded only a handful of detonations. Yet those few blasts, enhanced by the presence of fuel, produced a result disproportionate to their material cost. The tactics showcased a core principle of engineer warfare. When resources are limited, shaping enemy movement is more decisive than the strength of any single explosive charge. Soviet motorized logistics in 1942 operated under constant pressure to maintain tempo. In the Kharkov sector, rapid advances depended on fuel arriving precisely when frontline units required it. This urgency shaped the behavior of convoy commanders, who were instructed to avoid delays, bypass minor obstacles, and keep formation unless directly attacked. These procedures, designed to maintain operational flow, made the convoy susceptible to manipulation. The route taken on 21st May had been used days earlier by retreating German elements. Tracks, broken equipment, and scorched patches of soil were visible across the roadside. To a Soviet driver, this meant the Germans had already moved through, reducing the likelihood of new minefields. The decoy lane created by the German engineers blended seamlessly into this environment. Its markers appeared as remnants of scattered fences and collapsed farm structures. Not deliberate indicators, radio communication within the Soviet convoy was minimal. Standard procedure relied on visual cues. Follow the lead vehicle, maintain distance, avoid bunching only when terrain allowed. The narrowness of the road and the marshy ground on both sides left no room to disperse. Drivers were trained to trust the judgment of the lead armored car. If it advanced, the rest followed. The armored car crew, confident in their vehicle's ability to survive a mine blast better than the soft-skinned trucks, pushed forward without consulting sappers. Reconnaissance units were behind schedule, and the convoy commander prioritized speed over caution. The Germans had counted on exactly this pattern. The decoy lane exploited the assumption that if a heavy vehicle passed safely, the path must be clear. As the lead car rolled into the visually cleared corridor, subtle cues reinforced the illusion of safety. Soil appeared compressed. Tracks ran in a consistent line. The debris on both sides looked like it had been pushed aside by previous traffic. These impressions were intentional artifacts created by the engineers, who had studied similar behaviors earlier in the campaign. In the seconds before detonation, the convoy had reached its most vulnerable formation. Vehicles were lined up tightly to reduce exposure to imagined air threats. Drivers were focused on the narrow lane, not the terrain around them. The environment offered no escape options. Soft ground prevented sudden evasive turns. When the first mine exploded, The blast threw debris across the column, but momentum carried several trucks into the same path. The Soviet drivers, blinded by dust and flame, instinctively accelerated, a reaction that worsened the situation. Each truck that entered the corridor compressed additional charges. Surviving German engineers described the sequence as self-feeding. The destruction of one vehicle propelled burning fuel onto the next. The second explosion tore open tanks filled with aviation-grade gasoline, creating a fire sheet across the entire width of the road. The narrowness of the corridor transformed the burning fuel into a channel of heat and pressure. Within moments, visibility collapsed. Black smoke, dust, and flames obscured the road, preventing the rear elements from understanding that they were driving into a catastrophe. Soviet attempts to brake came too late. Several trucks collided with the burning wrecks ahead, rupturing their own tanks and adding to the chain reactions. In less than 3 minutes, the convoy's forward third was destroyed, the midsection immobilized, and the rest forced into retreat. The Germans had achieved a disproportionate effect not by overwhelming firepower, but by guiding enemy behavior into a predictable, fatal pattern. The German engineers responsible for the ambush were operating under extreme constraints. Supply shortages in the Kharkov sector meant that standard engineering stores were depleted, or scattered reports from the parent engineer battalion listed only a fraction of the usual mine complement, irregular fuse types, and minimal detonating cord. These conditions forced the engineers to design an obstacle that relied less on explosive strength and more on environmental manipulation. They began by examining the terrain. The road ran along a raised, compacted surface bordered by marsh and soft soil. Any vehicle attempting to bypass the road risked becoming immobilized. This funneling effect increased the predictability of the convoy's movement. The engineers reinforced this natural bottleneck by placing debris in the marshy areas, making them appear even less passable. The mine placement reflected a deliberate concentration rather than coverage. Instead of spreading charges randomly, they created a linear kill zone only a few meters wide. Improvised charges filled the gaps between standard teller mines. The engineers arranged Soviet anti-tank mines, captured earlier, despite uncertainty about their fuse reliability. They compensated for inconsistent activation thresholds by positioning several mines directly beneath likely wheel paths. The triggering mechanism was not designed for synchronization. Instead, the engineers relied on staggered detonations. The initial blast under the armored car was intended to rupture the lead vehicle's forward compartment and throw debris into the air. Even if the armored car survived, the blast would obscure vision for the following trucks. The second layer of mines was carefully positioned where the heavier fuel trucks would compress the soil more deeply. The engineers buried the charges deeper than regulations typically permitted. This ensured that lighter vehicles might pass without triggering them, while fully loaded trucks would apply enough force to activate the fuses. The deeper burial also amplified the soil displacement, directing the blast upward toward the fuel tanks. The engineers further enhanced the lethality by placing their limited stock of incendiary materials, mostly leftover signal flares, oil cans, and cloth soaked in fuel, near the expected ignition points. These items were not designed for demolition, but could ignite spilled gasoline. This improvised incendiary layer significantly increased the likelihood of a sustained fire. What appeared to Soviet observers as random debris placed along the road was in fact part of the triggering system's design. Some pieces were positioned to conceal subtle soil disturbance, while others were placed to shape the vehicle path. German engineers understood that an irregular-looking arrangement would appear less suspicious than one that seemed too perfectly constructed. The apparent stupidity of the setup was a calculated tactic. After placing the mines and decoys, the engineers withdrew to pre-selected observation points on slightly elevated ground. From these positions, they had direct visibility of the road, but were concealed by foliage and terrain folds. Their role during the detonation phase was purely observational. They carried no remote triggering device. The system relied entirely on the convoy's weight and movement. The 3-minute destruction of the convoy validated their approach. Small charges became massive ones when combined with fuel loads. Fragmented munitions acted as amplifiers when detonated beneath pressurized tanks. The engineers' use of the environment, terrain, enemy habits, and available debris, turned limited resources into a devastating obstacle. The impact extended beyond immediate destruction. The burning wreckage blocked the road for hours. Secondary fires ignited nearby brush. Soviet sappers arriving later struggled to clear the site due to unstable ammunition and extreme heat. What had begun as a resource-saving tactic evolved into a temporary shutdown of a critical supply artery. Although the destroyed convoy represented only a fraction of the Soviet logistical flow, the timing and location of the ambush amplified its strategic effect. The Kharkov sector in May 1942 was marked by rapid Soviet advances, with frontline formations heavily dependent on regular fuel resupply. A delay of even a few hours could slow mechanized spearheads, disrupt coordination, and force frontline commanders to pause operations while waiting for new deliveries. The convoy destroyed on 21st May was carrying high-octane aviation fuel intended for forward airstrips recently established behind the advancing Soviet lines. These makeshift bases supported reconnaissance flights and ground attack missions that played a crucial role in identifying German defensive repositioning. The loss of this fuel directly impacted the ability of Soviet air units to operate at the tempo required for the offensive. Several scheduled flights were canceled or reassigned to distant airfields, causing delays in reconnaissance updates. Furthermore, the road blocked by burning wreckage served as one of only two reliable supply routes in the local sector. The marshy terrain forced convoys to rely on elevated hard surface roads, and the destruction of vehicles in the narrow corridor created an impassable barrier. Recovery teams were unable to approach until the fires subsided. Soviet sappers had to dismantle wrecks under the threat of secondary explosions, extending the closure for much of the day. Logistical planners responded by rerouting convoys through a longer, less developed path. This detour added hours to delivery schedules and caused congestion as multiple columns attempted to use the same constricted road. Reports from Soviet staff officers recorded increased stress on transport units and delays in delivering ammunition and rations to frontline units. Mechanized formations near the German defensive line experienced fuel shortages, forcing some tank units to halt temporarily. On the German side, the delay offered a narrow but valuable window. German forces were conducting a complex withdrawal to more defensible positions, intending to lure Soviet units into overextended salients. The temporary pause in the Soviet offensive gave German divisions additional time to reorganize, lay new minefields, and reposition artillery signals. Intelligence noted a reduction in Soviet radio traffic linked to shifting supply flows, confirming that logistical constraints were affecting the tempo of operations. By evening, German reconnaissance confirmed that Soviet armored units had slowed significantly. Gaps between Soviet spearheads widened as some units outran their fuel supplies, while others waited for resupply. German commanders exploited this fragmentation, directing mobile reserves to probe the overextended Soviet units. The ambush on the convoy did not cause the operational pause alone, but it contributed to a cascade of delays that disrupted the synchronization of the Soviet advance. The destruction also had morale and psychological effects. Soviet drivers, recognizing that the Germans could still stage effective obstacles even while retreating, became more cautious. Convoy commanders increased spacing and reduced speed, measures that decreased vulnerability but also reduced throughput on critical supply routes. This shift in behavior further compounded delay. For the German engineers, the results confirmed the principle that small tactical actions could influence operational outcomes when applied at critical junctures. Their improvised obstacle forced the Soviets to adjust their logistical rhythm, and that adjustment reverberated across multiple levels of command. By the time the road was reopened, the offensive's momentum had already begun to shift. A 3-minute explosion had become a 12-hour disruption, shaping the tempo of a battle far larger than the small group of engineers who triggered it. Once the convoy erupted into flames, the German engineers faced a second challenge: withdrawing before Soviet forces could react. Pioneering doctrine emphasized that demolition units were never to remain near their obstacles after activation. Their value to the army lay not only in the destruction they caused, but in their ability to continue shaping the battlefield through successive delays. Immediately after the first explosion, the engineers moved along pre-planned egress routes. These paths avoided the main road and instead followed dry patches of ground identified during earlier reconnaissance. The retreat relied on speed and concealment rather than distance. Rather than disappearing deep into German-controlled territory, the engineers shifted laterally, relocating to wooded pockets several hundred meters from the explosion site. From these new positions, they could monitor Soviet reactions while remaining invisible. The marshy terrain and scattered forest created natural lines of concealment. Engineers avoided leaving footprints in soft ground by stepping on roots, fallen logs, and compacted earth. These movements were not improvised but based on mapped terrain studies completed days earlier, anticipating the need for rapid withdrawal. The Soviet response was predictable but slow. Convoys behind the destroyed column halted at various distances. Soldiers dismounted and advanced cautiously. Smoke and burning debris reduced visibility, making it difficult to determine whether the destruction was caused by mines, artillery, or retreating German forces. Reconnaissance elements debated whether the road had been ambushed by infantry or simply mined during withdrawal. The engineers relied on this confusion. A properly executed mine ambush leaves no obvious signatures, no gunfire, no visible enemy positions, no movement. The Soviets found no shell casings, no footprints, and no obvious firing points. They concluded that the Germans had fully withdrawn, unaware that the pioneers remained close enough to observe them. While Soviet sappers assessed the scene, German engineers prepared a secondary obstacle. It was far less elaborate than the initial setup. Small anti-personnel charges placed along likely approach routes to disrupt clearing efforts. The purpose was not to inflict heavy casualties, but to prolong the delay and force additional caution. A single detonation would cause Soviet sappers to reassess the site as dangerous, adding hours to the clearing process. This secondary tactic succeeded. A small charge detonated when Soviet engineers moved debris near the edge of the road. Although the blast caused limited damage, the reaction was immediate. Clearing teams withdrew, called for additional equipment, and waited for reinforcements. The process of clearing the wreckage slowed once again. Having completed this secondary delay, the German pioneers began their final withdrawal. They moved deeper toward German lines only after Soviet infantry started probing the woods in force. By then, the pioneers had already placed several minor booby traps along their exit path, not to stop pursuers, but to force them to slow down and approach with caution. The engineers returned with complete personnel accountability and minimal expenditure of resources. Their report emphasized that the success of the ambush depended on three elements: manipulation of convoy behavior, not the sheer number of explosives, use of terrain to channel both the enemy approach and their own retreat, secondary disruption to extend the delay beyond the initial blast. By the time Soviet forces finally cleared the road, the engineers were already preparing their next obstacle dozens of kilometers away. The German pioneering system was designed to use mobility and deception to multiply its influence, and the events of 21st May demonstrated how a small unit could extend its effect far beyond the immediate blast zone. The incident on 21st May provided a clear demonstration of how behavioral patterns within an opposing army could be weaponized. German engineers had long studied Soviet operational habits, spacing of convoys, reactions to debris, preferred routes, and inclination to prioritize speed over caution during advances. These observations were not abstract. They directly informed the tactics chosen for the ambush. The use of crude, carelessly placed markers reflected a deeper understanding of how Soviet convoy commanders interpreted the battlefield. German reports noted that Soviet drivers often relied on visual indicators rather than engineering reconnaissance, especially when pushing aggressively into recently abandoned territory. Decoy pathways created with branches and boards were designed specifically to trigger these instinctive decisions. What made the tactic effective was its subtlety. It exploited expectations without appearing deliberate. A perfectly straight lane would have raised suspicion. A messy, irregular one did not. It appeared neither cleared nor obstructed, just disturbed enough to look recently used. This was the ideal psychological channel. From a command perspective, the ambush also highlighted Soviet logistical rigidity. Convoy formations maintained tight spacing even when terrain made them vulnerable. Drivers were trained to follow the lead vehicle without deviation unless expressly ordered otherwise. Such procedures allowed large volumes of supply to move quickly, but created predictable patterns. German engineers built the kill zone, precisely to take advantage of this predictability. The event revealed another structural weakness, the shortage of forward-deployed Soviet sappers. Engineer units were often positioned behind the first wave of advancing troops, leaving supply columns exposed when traversing contested or uncertain terrain. A single pioneer detachment could exploit this gap by shaping the environment to trigger a mistake rather than forcing a confrontation. German internal analyses emphasized that the power of the ambush came not from the explosives themselves, but from the convoy's response. Drivers accelerated into the kill zone due to dust and shock. Rear vehicles continued forward because of limited visibility and narrow terrain. The engineers noted that most of the destruction resulted from secondary triggers, fuel ignition, collisions, and pressure-induced detonations from trucks piling into the same lane. The event became an example of a broader principle. An enemy's operational habits are as exploitable as their physical vulnerabilities. Even minimal resources can achieve outsized results when applied at choke points where the enemy's choices are constrained. Further investigation by German staff documented how the convoy reacted after the explosion. Units behind the firestorm did not attempt to break into the marshland or find alternate paths. Instead, they halted on the road, maintaining alignment even after the lead vehicles were destroyed. This behavioral inertia allowed the burning wreckage to block movement far more effectively than the explosions themselves. The engineers' tactic also disrupted Soviet timing. Convoys arriving later were confronted not with a hidden minefield, but with a visible disaster. The psychological effect of seeing charred vehicles and burning fuel forced commanders to reassess the risk of every road in the sector. This caution slowed movement for the rest of the day, amplifying the ambush's operational consequences. In essence, the success of the stupid-looking setup demonstrated that effective engineering did not always require sophisticated tools. It required understanding what the enemy would think when confronted with ambiguous information. By exploiting these assumptions, the engineers turned a handful of charges into a decisive delay. The event became part of a pattern of similar actions across the Eastern Front, small, low-cost obstacles designed to derail Soviet momentum at crucial moments. For German pioneering doctrine, the ambush was a validation. Deception and psychological shaping could substitute for firepower when resources ran thin. In the hours following the ambush, the Soviet command structure attempted to assess what had happened and restore the flow of supplies. But the incident exposed systemic weaknesses that could not be solved by simply clearing wreckage. The Soviet logistical system in mid-1942 was optimized for rapid forward movement, not for dealing with sudden, localized disruptions. The first problem was convoy density. Soviet doctrine favored pushing as many trucks forward as possible, often on a single available road. This approach worked when the enemy was in full retreat, but it created dangerous congestion when obstacles appeared. After the explosions, additional convoys approached from the rear, only to encounter halted vehicles and rising smoke. Without clear communication or alternate routes, these convoys had no option but to stop, creating a traffic buildup that extended kilometers down the road. Second, command clarity deteriorated. The forward elements had no reliable means to inform those behind them of the destruction ahead. Radio equipment was sparse and often reserved for combat units. As a result, some convoy commanders believed the road was under artillery fire and waited for orders to disperse, while others assumed it was a localized mechanical breakdown. This confusion increased delay far more than the physical barrier itself. Third, the Soviet sapper units dispatched to the scene lacked the specialized equipment needed for rapid clearance under hazardous conditions. The burning fuel, sporadic ammunition detonations, and structural collapse of truck frames made the site extremely dangerous. Engineers attempted to approach, but heat forced them back. They were trained primarily for mine detection and road repair, not for managing large-scale fuel fires involving dozens of vehicles. Even after the flames weakened, the presence of unstable tanks and scattered ordnance slowed progress. Each truck had to be inspected individually. Some were still smoldering, others appeared intact, but concealed live munitions. The lack of standardized protocols for clearing mass casualty vehicle sites meant that sapper teams proceeded cautiously, adding hours to the delay. Fourth, The Soviet system's reliance on strict road discipline became a disadvantage. Drivers were prohibited from attempting new paths without explicit orders, even when the terrain theoretically permitted it. This rigidity prevented improvisation. Convoys that might have attempted to bypass the wreckage through partially solid ground chose instead to wait, sticking to doctrine that emphasized order over initiative. The fifth weakness emerged at the operational level. As supply delays accumulated, frontline units reported fuel shortages that forced them to halt. Tanks positioned for the next phase of the offensive could not move. Artillery units reduced firing to conserve fuel for ammunition trucks. Air support missions were curtailed due to shortages at the forward airstrips. Each disruption compounded the next. Meanwhile, German intelligence monitored Soviet radio traffic and noted the growing friction. Reports showed inconsistencies between Soviet unit demands and supply deliveries. These discrepancies confirmed that the ambush had created a temporary but significant disconnect between frontline needs and logistical capacity. Even after the road was cleared, several hours after the initial blast, the terrain remained compromised. Melted asphalt, twisted metal, and deep craters made movement slow. Recovery vehicles repeatedly bogged down in softened ground. Soviet drivers moved with heightened caution, increasing spacing and lowering speed, which further reduced throughput. By nightfall, Soviet command understood that the delay had forced a resequencing of their broader operational plan. Units that were supposed to advance simultaneously now moved in staggered phases, allowing German forces to exploit openings. The ambush became a textbook example of how disruption to logistics spreads upward, affecting operational timing and strategic coherence. A 3-minute explosion created a delay far larger than the physical damage it produced, a small tactical action generating disproportionate operational consequences. While Soviet forces struggled with the destroyed convoy and the resulting traffic paralysis, German units used the unexpected pause to recalibrate their defense. In May 1942, German operational thinking emphasized exploiting enemy overextension rather than relying solely on static lines. The delay created by the ambush provided the exact conditions needed for such a maneuver. The first advantage came in time to reposition reserves. Mobile German units, primarily motorized infantry and small armored detachments, had been executing a controlled withdrawal toward more defensible terrain. The temporary halt in Soviet fuel deliveries reduced pressure on these retreating formations. They could break contact cleanly, reorganize, and redeploy without being overrun by fast-moving Soviet spearheads. Artillery units benefited as well. German batteries were often forced to relocate quickly during Soviet advances, risking loss of equipment. The slowdown allowed several batteries to complete planned withdrawals to pre-surveyed firing positions. Once established, these guns provided more effective defensive fire, targeting Soviet concentrations that had become congested on the stalled road networks. The second advantage came from improved battlefield intelligence. Reconnaissance aircraft and ground observers reported that the Soviet advance had lost coherence gaps formed between armored and infantry elements as some units ran low on fuel, while others waited for resupply. German commanders recognized these gaps as opportunities for localized counterattacks. Mobile reserves exploited the fragmentation. Small armored groups probed Soviet flanks, targeting units that had outpaced their logistical support. Infantry detachments extended minefields and fortified choke points, anticipating slower Soviet movements in the coming hours. These preparations would have been impossible under normal offensive pressure. The third advantage emerged at the operational headquarters level. The delay allowed German staff to update situational maps more accurately. Earlier, rapid Soviet advances had created uncertainty about unit positions. With their movement interrupted, the Soviets became easier to track. Clearer intelligence enabled German planners to identify weak points in the Soviet formation and coordinate countermoves accordingly. Another consequence involved German air operations. Luftwaffe units operating in the sector had limited fuel but retained readiness for targeted strikes. When reconnaissance confirmed Soviet congestion along key roads, German aircraft launched attacks on secondary convoys, attempting to reroute. These strikes further strained Soviet logistics, compounding the original disruption caused by the ambush. The psychological impact also played a role. German frontline reports indicated improved morale as soldiers observed the Soviet slowdown. For days, German troops had been retreating under pressure. The sudden stall in the Soviet advance signaled that the enemy was not invulnerable. This shift in perception mattered, especially among units tasked with holding newly established defensive lines. In addition, the ambush validated German engineering doctrine at higher command levels. Reports from the field highlighted how minimal resources, when applied intelligently, could alter operational tempo. This reinforced confidence in similar delaying tactics and encouraged commanders to allocate engineering units where they could exert the greatest influence. By the end of 21st May, German lines were more stable, artillery positions had been strengthened, reconnaissance data was improved, and small counterattacks were already underway. The delay had not reversed the broader situation, but it had given German forces a critical breathing window. And in fluid operations, time was often more decisive than firepower. The destruction of a single convoy had cascaded into a multi-layered operational shift. The battlefield was no longer shaped solely by large formations. It was shaped by timing, tempo, and the exploitation of an enemy's momentary paralysis. By the morning of 22nd May, the physical wreckage of the destroyed convoy had been cleared, but the operational consequences lingered. Soviet units resumed the advance, yet their tempo no longer matched the momentum of the previous days. Fuel and ammunition deliveries were out of sync with frontline demands, air support remained inconsistent, and armored spearheads lacked the logistical depth to sustain aggressive movement. German forces, meanwhile, continued to exploit the breathing room. Divisions that had been at risk of collapse were able to rebuild defensive cohesion, fresh minefields were laid, communication lines reestablished, and artillery assets repositioned to cover likely Soviet approaches. The delay created a defensive architecture that the Soviets would now have to dismantle under fire, an inversion of the situation that existed just 24 hours earlier. The ambush on 21st May did not decide the outcome of the Kharkov operations on its own. But within the context of a fast-moving front, even small disruptions carried amplified consequences. German engineering doctrine understood this concept well. When fighting a numerically superior opponent, the key was to influence timing, not annihilation. Slowing the enemy, even briefly, could reshape the balance of initiative. Post-action analysis by German staff highlighted several factors that made the ambush disproportionately effective. Precise exploitation of enemy behavior. Soviet convoy procedures made them predictable under pressure terrain manipulation. The engineers turned a single road into a forced channel where even small charges became fatal. Fuel as a force multiplier. The engineers recognized that destroying fuel trucks would create cascading ignition beyond the capacity of their limited explosives. Psychological disruption. Uncertainty about additional traps slowed Soviet units long after the original wreckage was removed. Operational timing. The delay aligned perfectly with German withdrawal plans, giving units critical hours to reset their defense. The Soviets, in turn, recognized the incident as evidence that the German retreat was not disorganized, but deliberately structured around engineered obstacles. Their subsequent advances became more cautious, reducing the tempo that had previously driven them deep into German lines. German engineers who executed the ambush were later commended for their effectiveness, but their methods remained grounded in necessity rather than innovation. They had taken scraps of available material, few mines, captured charges, random debris, and arranged them in a way that leveraged enemy habits more than raw explosive force. It was improvisation shaped by doctrine, experience, and acute observation. The 3-minute destruction of the convoy exemplified a pattern repeated across the Eastern Front. Small-scale engineering actions shaping the tempo of entire operations. While large battles were decided by armies and divisions, the rhythm of those battles was often dictated by the invisible work of pioneer units. Those who carved the terrain, slowed the enemy, and turned time itself into a defensive weapon. In retrospect, the incident serves as a reminder that warfare is often decided not by grand strategy alone, but by moments when a handful of soldiers, equipped with almost nothing, apply their knowledge of terrain and enemy behavior to create disproportionate effects. On 21st May 1942, one improvised trap did exactly that, transforming limited resources into a delay that rippled across the battlefield, shaping decisions, movements, and outcomes far beyond its small patch of road. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.